Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Dar's Nights. I know many of you use these videos to relax or fall asleep, so before you drift off, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable and begin. Somewhere along the forgotten stretch of Highway 17, buried beneath snow and silence, lies an old ice house that locals refuse to speak of. Inside, bodies, frozen in time, wait to be discovered, their deaths never investigated, their killer never caught. But when a young state trooper stumbles across the truth, he doesn't just uncover a horrifying string of murders, he uncovers his blood-soaked legacy. This is not just a crime. This is a family curse. Welcome to the case of the Icebox Murders of Highway 17. There's a place in northern Minnesota where the winters never seem to end, where the snow stacks against doors like a warning and the wind carries with it the sound of things long buried. It's the kind of place that doesn't show up on GPS, where even phone signals fade like dying breath. Locals call it dead country, not because of any folklore, but because nothing grows, nothing changes, and no one new ever moves in. It's just a stretch of icy highway, some skeletal trees, and a scattering of houses that have long since forgotten what warmth feels like. Highway 17 cuts straight through this forgotten land, a cracked ribbon of asphalt lined with rusting signs and broken fences. Travelers who veer off the main interstate and find themselves here don't usually stay long. Most turn around. Some run out of gas and walk. A few never leave. The highway doesn't get much traffic, and the town it passes through, known simply as Carrion Falls, hasn't had a population increase in over 30 years. In fact, its census records haven't been updated since 1994, and even then, no one could agree on how many people actually live there. Carrion Falls was once a logging town, its lifeblood tied to the forest. But when the mill shut down in the late 70s, most families packed up and left. Those who stayed behind did so for reasons no outsider ever fully understood. They spoke in quiet tones, kept their curtains drawn, and didn't much care for questions. Outsiders were watched but never greeted. Kids were raised to avoid the lake after dark. And there was one place everyone steered clear of completely, the old ice house near the northern woods. It stood like a mausoleum, its roof sagging under years of snow, its windows blacked out with thick sheets of plywood. Most people assumed it was a relic of the logging era, used for storing ice before refrigeration became standard. No one maintained it. No one claimed ownership. Yet somehow, year after year, the snow around it stayed neatly cleared, as though someone or something was still using it. Every now and then, hunters would find fresh tracks leading up to its door, but they never stayed to investigate. Even the sheriff's office, under-equipped and understaffed, didn't list it on any maps or records. It was as if the building had slipped through the cracks of reality. Stories circulated among the younger locals, passed down like bad dreams. Some said it was a mob hideout, a dumping ground for bodies nobody wanted found. Others whispered that it was cursed, that anyone who went inside came back wrong, or didn't come back at all. No one ever proved anything, of course. There were no missing person reports officially tied to it. No police investigations. Just silence and snow and that looming, rotten building standing watch at the edge of the woods. But there were things that didn't add up. Over the years, rumors surfaced of hikers who never returned, of tourists whose abandoned cars were found near Highway 17 with the keys still in the ignition. The town's old mechanic kept a book of license plates from vehicles he towed from the roadside, over 50 in the last 2 decades alone. Most were never claimed. And when asked about them, he'd just shrug and mutter something about people getting lost in the snow. But there was a heaviness to his voice, the kind that comes from knowing more than you'll ever say out loud. The deeper one looked, the stranger the history became. The town's church had burned down 3 times. Each fire occurred exactly 17 years apart. Each time, the congregation had gathered again, as though nothing unusual had happened. The school had shut down in the early 90s, supposedly due to funding issues, but parents from nearby towns claimed their children came home whispering about things they'd seen through the windows, people standing motionless in the woods, staring back. No one ever caught them. No one ever admitted to seeing them up close. Most troubling of all were the bodies. Not the ones that were found, but the ones that weren't. Every few years, someone from Carrion Falls would simply vanish. A farmer, a drifter, a store clerk. No signs of struggle. No farewell notes. The town mourned in its own quiet way and moved on. No search parties. No vigils. As if they all understood something unspoken, that when the ice takes someone, you don't ask for them back. It wasn't until the winter of 2024 that anything truly changed. That was when the snow began to fall harder than usual, blanketing the highway and forcing an unusual number of travelers to take detours. One of them was a young state trooper named Evan Marshall, newly transferred and eager to prove himself. His GPS rerouted him through Highway 17 during a storm, and from that moment on, things began to unravel. He didn't know the town. He didn't know the stories. And he certainly didn't know that his arrival would stir something that had been frozen in silence for decades. Something that had been waiting. The storm came fast, a whiteout swallowing the horizon as Evan Marshall's cruiser crawled through the snow-choked roadways. Officially, he was on reroute, following dispatch instructions to avoid a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate. Unofficially, he was being pushed toward something he could neither explain nor anticipate. The farther he drove, the quieter the world became, until all that remained was the dull crunch of tires on snow and the ever-growing weight of isolation. Highway 17 didn't feel like a road, it felt like a descent. Carrion Falls hadn't been part of his training brief. It didn't appear on the standard jurisdictional map and wasn't mentioned during orientation. Even the precinct's regional directories listed it as inactive, with no assigned patrol schedule. But the moment Evan crossed the faded welcome sign, something shifted. His radio lost signal. His phone refused to connect. And worst of all, the temperature dropped unnaturally fast, as though the air itself resented his presence. The town looked like a photograph from a lost decade. Frozen storefronts lined the narrow streets, their signs weathered and half erased. The gas station displayed prices that hadn't existed in years. A church steeple loomed in the distance, but its stained glass had been blacked out by soot. The entire town felt paused, like it had been waiting, not forgotten. A single blinking light at the precinct window was the only sign of life. The station was small, 2 desks, a rusted filing cabinet, and a holding cell that hadn't seen use in years. It smelled like mildew and melted snow. A single coat still hung on the wall, dusty and abandoned, its name tag scratched out. The previous officer had left everything behind in a hurry. No note, no reassignment paperwork. Just gone. The official report said, retired early due to personal circumstances. Locals refused to talk about him. No one ever used his name. Evan tried to adjust. He logged his hours. He drove the length of the highway. He checked in with dispatch, though no one ever answered. Days passed in a strange loop. There were no calls, no traffic stops, just the unchanging rhythm of wind, snow, and the occasional shape moving in the trees just beyond the light. He assumed it was wildlife. But even the animals in this place seemed too quiet, like they were hiding from something that used to roam freely but had returned. The townspeople were no better. When he walked into the diner, the few patrons would fall silent. Conversations stopped mid-word. No one made eye contact. No one asked his name. They ate in silence, paid in cash, and left before sunset. Even the server, an older woman with trembling hands, only spoke once when she whispered, "Don't follow the plow trucks," before turning away like she hadn't said anything at all. It wasn't long before Evan noticed patterns. Every third night, at exactly 2:11 a.m., a snowplow would pass through town. Its lights were dim, its engine louder than it needed to be, but no one ever saw where it came from. It would vanish behind the ice house at the edge of the forest and never return from the other side. No other roads existed there. No paths. Just the woods. When Evan asked around, he was met with blank stares or muttered warnings. It was the only vehicle no one claimed to have seen. The longer he stayed, the more disconnected he felt. His sleep grew fragmented. Nightmares bled into waking moments. He'd find himself standing outside the station at dawn, unable to recall how he got there. On his patrols, he began seeing the same abandoned truck parked in different places, always with the door open and the engine off, always pointing toward the woods. Each time he approached, it was gone before he could take a second look. It became impossible to tell what was memory and what was imagination. On his sixth night, he tried to radio in for a wellness check, just to break the silence, but the radio only gave static. Just as he was about to shut it off, something came through. A voice. Crackling low, almost a whisper. "It's your turn." Then nothing. He waited. Called back. No reply. He wrote it off as interference. He wanted to believe that. Inside the station, he began finding things that hadn't been there before. A file folder resting on the desk. Black and white photographs. Old Polaroids of frozen landscapes, each with a shape just visible in the corner. A shadow. A boot print. A hand reaching out of the snow. They weren't dated. They weren't labeled. But the handwriting on the back of each one was the same. Scrawled, shaking, and clearly done in haste. Most of them simply read, "He's still here." Evan didn't know who he was. But every night, he felt the presence more clearly. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't stress. It was the knowledge, deep and primal, that he wasn't just observing the town. He was being studied. That his arrival hadn't gone unnoticed. That something beneath the ice had stirred, recognizing him not as a stranger, but as a returning piece of something unfinished. He wasn't just a new cop in an old town. He was a missing part of a story that had been waiting to continue. The temperature in Carrion Falls never rose above freezing. Not even during what should have been the spring thaw. Snow didn't melt. It hardened into jagged sheets of frost that curled around doorways and window panes like claws. Even the trees looked skeletal, their branches stiff with hoarfrost, groaning under invisible weight. The town existed in permanent stasis, caught between seasons, between decay and dormancy. What looked like a harsh winter was something else entirely, an atmospheric anomaly caused by an unseen force tethered to the soil. Evan's grip on time weakened with every passing day. Dates on his calendar began to repeat. His watch ticked steadily but didn't match the daylight. No matter how often he adjusted it, the hands always drifted back, usually to 2:11 a.m., the exact moment when the mysterious snowplow passed through town. He once marked an entire week's worth of shifts, only to discover all his logs were dated for the same Monday. The more he tried to verify his own reality, the more fragmented it became. The town's archives held no answers. Police reports prior to 1981 were sealed in mold-eaten boxes. The few he managed to read were redacted beyond comprehension, entire paragraphs blacked out, names replaced by numbers, incidents labeled weather-related psychological disturbances. A strange repetition of the term internal freeze appeared in multiple reports, always marked urgent but never explained. The files didn't just hide information. They felt like warnings written by people who had lost their ability to articulate what they'd seen. Something older than the precinct lingered beneath the town's surface. A pattern of disappearances dating back decades formed a map of concentric circles. Always 6 victims. Always found frozen. Always arranged in a perfect hexagon around a central point. Locals whispered about the ice house at the forest's edge but never went near it. The building appeared in none of the town's blueprints and didn't exist on any official register. Yet it remained standing, untouched by rust or time, coated in frost that never melted. The original builder of the ice house was never identified. Property deeds referred to a trust established by an anonymous donor in 1902. Since then, it had changed hands over a dozen times, though no one could recall anyone actually entering or using it. The doors were sealed shut with thick chains and padlocks, but Evan noticed footprints leading to and from the site in fresh snow, barefoot impressions too large to belong to any normal person, with long, narrow toes and deep archless prints that sank unnaturally into the earth. The idea of a person living out there, in that cold, in that silence, seemed impossible. And yet every path, every sighting, every unexplained death pointed back to the ice house. Its influence wasn't confined to its perimeter. Those who came too close were marked. Officers before Evan had left behind journal entries, fragmented reports, and in one case, a single audio tape that degraded the longer it played. The final sound on that tape was not a voice, but a slow dragging noise followed by a sharp, wet crack, replayed over and over until the magnetic tape snapped. People didn't retire from Carrion Falls. They disappeared. The town simply erased them. Officers, residents, even entire families, gone without closure, explanation, or investigation. Their homes were reoccupied. Their names removed from public record. Their memories treated like myths. The town's resilience wasn't ignorance, it was fear. A culture of silence cultivated over generations, passed down like an heirloom. No one admitted to remembering the past, but everyone followed the same unspoken rules. Stay off the road after dark. Never approach the ice house. Never ask who drives the snowplow. Evan's sleep worsened. His dreams grew colder. He would wake with frost on his fingertips and dried blood beneath his nose. His mirror sometimes reflected things that weren't there, a figure standing in the corner of the room, not moving, not blinking. It never appeared in real life, but its presence lingered. His memories began to blur. He couldn't recall his transfer date, his old precinct's name, the voice of his supervisor, the smell of summer rain. Everything before Carrion Falls dissolved into fog. He began to suspect he wasn't chosen for this post. He was summoned. The town didn't want help. It wanted containment. Carrion Falls was not a location. It was a quarantine zone. Whatever lived beneath the frost, whatever slept inside the ice house, had roots deeper than any foundation. The weather wasn't natural. The disappearances weren't random. The ice was not just cold, it was sentient. And the plow that came each third night wasn't clearing the road. It was collecting. Evan no longer trusted what he saw. Street signs moved. Snowbanks hid shapes that shifted just out of frame. The power grid remained functional, but the lights flickered in Morse code patterns he couldn't decode. Static on the radio began to whisper fragmented sentences that mirrored his own thoughts. The town had begun speaking to him. It didn't use language. It used reflection, mimicry, repetition. It mirrored his movements, his voice, his memories. And slowly, it started to replace them. He had entered Carrion Falls as a man. But something in the snow was reshaping him. Evan's world contracted. The further he investigated, the smaller everything became. Streets looped back on themselves. Maps contradicted each other. Even the sky seemed closer, as if pressing down, lowering the horizon inch by inch. Time unraveled in loops. Snowstorms came without clouds. Nights fell before dusk ended. Clocks reset themselves even when unplugged. Days bled into each other without color or warmth. Carrion Falls had become a sealed system, and he was trapped inside it, not as an observer, but as an ingredient. He found a box in the precinct's evidence locker with no case number. Just a single label, June 6th. Inside were 6 photos, all dated differently, all showing frozen bodies posed in the exact same way. Arms crossed, eyes open, mouths partially parted like they had been trying to scream but were silenced mid-breath. Each body had distinct clothing, era-specific artifacts beside them, wristwatches from different decades, paper currency long out of circulation, rusted sheriff badges. They hadn't died together. They had been collected over time, but stored in the same position, in the same perfect preservation. Nothing about the bodies showed decay. No insects, no rot, no signs of warmth having ever touched their flesh. In one photo, he recognized the badge number pinned to the body's uniform. It matched the ID of a former officer who had supposedly retired 22 years ago. The official record claimed he'd moved to Arizona. But a search into real estate records showed no such purchase. No utilities in his name. No death certificate. No living relatives. It was as if the man had been erased, but not before being frozen and placed among the others. Carrion Falls had no morgue, no functioning coroner. Autopsies were outsourced to a facility miles away, but their reports always came back inconclusive or, more often, returned completely blank. In one case, the package arrived with an empty folder and no accompanying explanation. Calls to the lab were never answered. Emails bounced back undeliverable. The facility's website redirected to a gardening supply store. It was as if the place had never existed. Like everything connected to the town's dead, it had simply stopped being real. The highway cameras, installed after a rash of unexplained collisions years prior, showed no footage of any vehicles entering or leaving town after 2 a.m. That included the snowplow. At first, Evan assumed a technical error, but the cameras functioned perfectly at all other times. Footage between 2 o'clock and 2:18 a.m. was always blank. No static, no darkness, just nothing, like reality itself had blinked out during those minutes. Attempts to install new surveillance equipment failed. Devices melted into ice or stopped functioning entirely. Wires shorted for no reason. Digital memory wiped itself clean. It was as if the town refused to be observed during that stretch of time. Residents had stopped asking questions generations ago. The old families, those who lived closest to the outer tree line, had developed their own internal rituals. Shutters were drawn at sunset regardless of the season. Windows were double-sealed from the inside. Basement freezers were kept full, not with food, but with bricks of ice. On certain nights, candles were left burning in bowls of salt by the front door. No one admitted to knowing why, but everyone did it. They obeyed, not from belief, but from inherited fear. Evan tried to leave once. Packed a bag. Left his badge. Took the highway west. He passed the same sign 3 times. Welcome to Carrion Falls. A place to call home. His fuel gauge dropped, but the distance on his odometer never changed. The GPS blinked between unknown and NO signal. After an hour, he stopped the car, stepped outside, and looked around. The road behind him had vanished. No tire marks, no footprints. Just untouched snow, thick and glimmering like crushed glass under a gray sky. He drove back without realizing it. The town greeted him in silence. The streetlights turned on by themselves. His badge was waiting for him in the center of his desk. The ice house, once chained, now sat ajar. No sign of forced entry. Just the door, slightly open, steam rising from within, not from heat, but from a deeper, colder source. A vapor so dense it hummed against the air like a low-frequency pulse. The sound lodged behind his ears and stayed there, even miles away. At night, he could feel the building breathing, expanding and contracting like a lung encased in frost. It was alive. Not metaphorically, but biologically. It had pulse, pressure, and presence. It was a being that had been dormant for decades, and something had started to wake it. He noticed the same 6 faces appearing in the crowd during town events, always at the edge, never participating. They did not blink. They did not speak. Their skin was pale, almost translucent. Their eyes were not quite focused, like glass orbs stuck in wax. Each wore out-of-date clothing. Each had been declared missing decades ago, and yet there they stood, as though the town had regurgitated them whole, but different. Their presence was not comforting. It was a threat, a reminder of what waited beyond the frost. Whatever was buried under Carrion Falls was beginning to surface, not as a ghost, not as a myth, but as something tangible, a force of hunger, memory, and cold logic. And Evan was no longer just investigating the murders. He was becoming part of them. Every file Evan touched seemed to rewrite itself. Reports that once documented specific names or incidents blurred into redacted lines or vague summaries. Dates shifted by a day or two, photos degraded into static. Even his notes, scrawled in pen and locked in drawers, began to change. One page he remembered writing in haste about 7 frozen bodies, now read 6 found, 1 incomplete. Another note, originally a street name, had become an indecipherable word resembling a foreign dialect or a set of coordinates that led nowhere. The ink remained his handwriting, but the thoughts were no longer his. Sleep was a memory, not because he refused it, but because it no longer arrived naturally. When he closed his eyes, he didn't dream. He entered spaces, cold, fluorescent, tiled corridors filled with humming machines and distant metallic clatters. He woke up with frost clinging to his eyelashes. Once, he woke in his patrol car, a fresh layer of snow on his boots, parked outside the old slaughterhouse north of town, a place that hadn't operated in 30 years and was now boarded shut. His ignition was still running. The fuel tank read full. But his mind had no memory of ever going there. Others were being pulled in too. The new rookie officer, Tyler, began stammering during routine calls. His pupils dilated even in daylight. He kept repeating one phrase, "They're listening through the ice." Dispatchers logged calls they swore never came in, distorted voices begging to be let out, asking for the cold. Then, during one graveyard shift, Tyler vanished. His cruiser was found idling on a shoulder just a few miles from the ice house. The driver's door was open. Steam rose from the seats. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. His badge lay in the snow, already frosted over. No one filed a missing person report. People forgot him almost immediately. Old newspaper clippings from the Carrion Falls Gazette had begun to reappear in the town archives. Pages once believed lost to mold or fire damage were now crisp, perfectly preserved. The articles weren't about the town's founding or politics. They documented deaths, unexplained disappearances, bodies discovered on ice banks, children who wandered too close to the woods and were never seen again. Every article ended with a variation of the same phrase, "returned to the deep cold." It wasn't a local idiom. It wasn't in any lexicon. But somehow, everyone in town seemed to understand what it meant. A letter surfaced in a locked desk at the precinct, yellowed, unsigned, dated 1934. The language was plain but chilling. It spoke of an entity that had existed beneath the town before settlers arrived. Something not born of flesh, but memory. A consciousness that fed on presence. Every person who remembered it gave it shape. Those who feared it gave it power. And those who denied it made it stronger. It never needed followers. It only needed to be noticed. Local records indicated the town's population had never changed. Always 2,117. Year after year. Census after census. When a family left, another moved in within days, often without announcement. Some families never aged. Some children never grew. Photos taken 50 years apart showed identical people in background crowds, wearing period-appropriate clothing, but with the same faces, same expressions. Town festivals, parades, school graduations, all captured the same static repetition. It wasn't reincarnation. It was replication. As if the town was replaying its own version of time, preserving its most useful parts, discarding the rest. The ice house began to emit sound. Not noise, but a tone, low, sustained, vibrating just below the level of perception. It rattled metal fixtures and caused frost to bloom on the insides of windshields. Animals fled town entirely. No birds circled overhead. No strays roamed the streets. Deer carcasses were found arranged in spirals at the edge of the woods, frozen solid with no sign of struggle. People stopped using the term cold front. They simply said, "It's returning." The church bell tower rang by itself on nights when no one was there. The chimes matched no traditional pattern. They sounded mechanical, like a signal being transmitted through steel. Those who heard it too long developed nosebleeds or migraines. One man gouged out his ears with a screwdriver and survived just long enough to write, "It sees through sound." He died from shock. No one claimed his body. His face never made it into the paper. Homes close to the edge of town began to disappear, not slowly, but entirely. One night a farmhouse stood with lights on, smoke in the chimney. The next day, the ground was flat and frozen. No foundation, no debris. The snow over it was smooth and undisturbed, like nothing had ever existed there. Families vanished with it. No one searched. No one questioned. The town adjusted its records automatically. Evan no longer checked the time. There was no point. Time in Carrion Falls didn't move forward. It circled, a frozen loop replaying itself over and over until enough people believed it had always been this way. And every moment of doubt was just fuel for the thing beneath the ice. Every breath taken in ignorance fed its lungs. Every silence offered it space to grow. Carrion Falls wasn't haunted. Carrion Falls was the ghost. Nothing left the town anymore. Not mail, not packages, not people. GPS signals flickered and failed within a mile of the town border. Phones stopped working just past mile marker 47, where Highway 17 dipped into a frost-covered basin and the sky seemed lower than it should be. Trucks rerouted without explanation. Travelers reported blackouts just before arrival and had no memory of reaching Carrion Falls. They would only remember leaving, disoriented, hours later, with frost on their lips and the taste of metal in their mouths. Most refused to speak about it. A few simply never spoke again. Evan's face no longer appeared in mirrors. His reflection was always off by a fraction, his expression too still, eyes unblinking, mouth slightly open. At first it was subtle. Then it grew bolder. The reflection began to move before he did, turning its head, watching him, studying. On one occasion, his reflection failed to appear at all, and in its place was the frost-covered silhouette of a man in uniform, face obscured, breathing slow and audible. A deep crack spidered across the mirror's surface after that moment, though no impact had occurred. The files about the original murders were now missing entirely. Every physical trace had been wiped clean. The name Icebox Murders no longer yielded results in any digital or paper archive. Even the victims' families were gone. Old addresses led to vacant lots. Grave markers had no inscriptions. Obituaries were blank. The town no longer acknowledged that any crime had ever happened. It wasn't denial, it was deletion. A systemic purge of memory and identity so complete that even those who tried to resist began doubting their own memories. The frost line spread. Buildings began to crack and splinter under the strain of unnatural cold. Pipes burst beneath the streets despite maintenance. Cars froze in driveways after seconds of exposure. The temperature dropped sharply, but only inside the town limits. Just outside Carrion Falls, the weather remained typical for the season. But within, every breath steamed like January, and ice formed inside lungs, clinging to rib cages like vines. Hospitals filled with patients who couldn't get warm. Thermometers malfunctioned. Blood tests came back with unreadable results. Children stopped speaking altogether. Their eyes grew distant, their skin paler. They gathered in groups near the edges of the frozen lots, standing still for hours, staring at where buildings used to be. One child was found tracing symbols into the frost on a police cruiser's windshield. Strange geometric loops, spirals, and intersecting lines that resembled antenna structures or archaic alphabets. No adult could reproduce them from memory. When photographed, the images refused to appear in any file or print. Old clocks hidden in the town museum began ticking again, even though most hadn't functioned in decades. All chimed together at 3:17 a.m. every night without fail. The sound carried through the streets, soft and slow, like heartbeat pulses, vibrating deep into the bones of every living thing. Some people began disappearing at exactly that time, mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought, leaving behind steaming footprints or a warm indentation in bed sheets. None were ever found. All records of their existence faded shortly after. A fissure opened beneath the old slaughterhouse. Snow refused to settle over it. The ground steamed upward as if something beneath was exhaling. Residents started whispering about the deep cold, not as a place, but as a being. A living memory that rewrote the world around it to keep itself hidden in plain sight. The more people learned, the stronger it became. Curiosity was its invitation. Memory was its nourishment. Forgetting it was the only escape, but the more one tried to forget, the more entangled one became in its grasp. The town council resigned all at once. No explanation, no announcement. Their offices were left locked from the inside, frost covering every surface. Their chairs, desks, and walls were coated in a thin layer of rime, as if a blizzard had swept through while the rest of the building remained untouched. Keys were left in their doors, frozen in place. Files inside the drawers were nothing but blank sheets of paper, perfectly stacked and unmarred. The town had no leadership, and no one stepped in to take over. Visitors who once planned to explore Carrion Falls never made it past the signs. Their vehicles stalled, their electronics died, and their maps rerouted. Locals stopped giving directions. The library's town maps were burned in a sudden fire that no one reported. The fire alarm didn't go off. No water was used. And the only thing left was a single sign posted to the front door in shaky black marker, "Let it be forgotten." Then came the frost flowers, crystalline patterns that grew on windows and walls, spreading in fractal formations too complex for nature. At first, they resembled snowflakes. But slowly, they began to resemble eyes, mouths, even faces pressed against the glass, screaming silently from within the ice. One of them bore a perfect replica of Evan's badge number. Another showed the distorted outline of the very first victim's body, as if memory itself had been flash-frozen into the fabric of the town. Carrion Falls no longer existed on any current map. The highway that led to it now listed "No Access." GPS labeled it "Restricted Area." State records claimed the town had been unincorporated since 1973. There was no census data, no postal route, no living mayor. Those who remembered it found themselves doubting their sanity. Those who visited rarely left the same. And those who stayed were no longer truly human. The town had devoured its history, consumed its truth, and erased its sins by freezing time itself. And beneath the streets, beneath the ice, something still waited, awake, aware, and endlessly hungry for what little warmth remained in the hearts of men. Because some places aren't haunted by ghosts. Some places are haunted by forgetting. End of Story 1. Story 2. Imagine finding a letter in your mailbox, except it's not yours. And inside, a chilling description of a murder that hasn't happened yet. At first, you think it's a sick joke, until the nightmare comes true. But if the original killer is long dead, then who's writing these letters? This is the terrifying mystery of the mailbox at the end of Willow Lane, where the past refuses to stay buried, and the future is written in blood. The mailbox appeared one morning at the end of Willow Lane, a narrow, quiet street where nothing ever seemed to change. It was old and rusted, covered in peeling paint and streaks of grime, its flag bent awkwardly as if forgotten for decades. No one remembered seeing it before. It sat alone on a cracked wooden post, just beyond the last house, facing the empty road that curved into thick woods. Neighbors passed by it every day, initially ignoring it like any forgotten relic. Then the letters started. At first, just one or two residents found them tucked inside the mailbox, yellowed and brittle, written in a cramped, uneven hand. The envelopes had no return address and no stamps, as if they'd appeared from thin air. The first letters contained strange, fragmented sentences, odd descriptions of places and people, vague mentions of shadows and cold nights. The handwriting was smudged and shaky, as if penned by a nervous hand. Most dismissed these letters as pranks, the product of some bored teenager playing with the neighborhood's nerves. But then the letters grew darker. More people found them, and each letter told a story about a murder that was going to happen, complete with dates and times. Victims were named, locations described with chilling accuracy. It was as if the letters were not just warnings but detailed prophecies. The content was too specific to be coincidence. The color of a victim's coat, the last words they whispered, the precise hour the crime would unfold. The letters spread through the community like wildfire, seeping into conversations, causing whispered speculation and mounting unease. Skepticism battled fear. Many refused to believe these were anything more than elaborate fiction. Others locked their doors, stopped walking their dogs after dark, and watched the mailbox warily whenever they passed. The local police department dismissed it as harmless mischief, promising extra patrols but making no arrests. No suspects, no fingerprints, no clues. Then the first murder happened. It was exactly as the letter had described. The victim was found lifeless in their home, just as the chilling letter predicted. The details matched with a precision that defied logic. The broken window, the faint smell of burning wood, even the victim's watch stopped at the exact time mentioned in the note. Panic gripped the neighborhood. Letters continued to arrive, now in increasing numbers, each predicting a new killing. The residents no longer saw the mailbox as a relic. It had become a dark oracle, a harbinger of terror that none could explain. Despite police efforts, the murders continued, and no one could stop them. Every letter was received days before a body was discovered, each prophecy fulfilled without fail. Among the growing fear, a retired journalist named Ethan became obsessed. Years ago, he had covered crime stories and cold cases, but nothing like this. The letters' precision, their chilling nature, it was beyond any story he had encountered. His curiosity pulled him deeper. The mystery of the mailbox became a puzzle he felt compelled to solve, both for his own peace of mind and to protect the neighborhood that once felt like home. Ethan began collecting every letter he could find, documenting dates, victims, and the details mentioned. He searched archives for any connection to previous crimes, hoping to find a thread linking these modern horrors to something from the past. What he discovered was troubling. The mailbox had a dark history. Decades earlier, the same mailbox had been the property of a man who terrorized the town. A serial killer from the 1960s who used it to taunt law enforcement, leaving letters detailing his crimes and hinting at his next victim. The killer was eventually caught and executed, but the mailbox remained, a silent witness to a past that should have been buried with him. This revelation deepened the horror. If the killer was long dead, how could the letters still be arriving? Who was behind them now? And why were the killings continuing with the same brutal precision? Neighbors whispered about curses, spirits, and otherworldly forces. The mailbox was no longer just an object. It was a symbol of something terrible, something that refused to die. The sense of dread grew heavier every day. Windows were boarded up, children were kept inside, and the once tight-knit community became fractured by suspicion and fear. Ethan's investigation led him to interviews with elderly residents who remembered the original killer's reign of terror. They described a man who reveled in manipulation, whose letters were meant to spread panic and helplessness. Yet none could explain how this nightmare had returned, or how the mailbox had become a conduit for death once more. Meanwhile, the letters kept coming, each more sinister than the last. They spoke of darkness closing in, of hidden eyes watching, and of secrets better left forgotten. Some mentioned names no one had heard before, others hinted at places outside the town limits, beyond the woods. Every new note added layers to a mystery that seemed to grow beyond human understanding. Ethan realized this was no ordinary case. It wasn't just about murder or madness. It was about a force that fed on fear and pain, using the mailbox as a channel between past and present, life and death. His obsession became a race against time, trying to decipher the letters before more lives were lost. The mailbox at the end of Willow Lane had become a deadly messenger. What it delivered was no longer just paper and ink, but fate itself. The first murder shattered the fragile illusion of safety that had held the neighborhood together. It was not just the act of violence itself that terrified everyone, but the eerie accuracy with which the letter had predicted it. Details that only the killer, or someone with impossible knowledge, could have known were laid bare, as if the writer had witnessed every moment firsthand. The victim was a local woman named Claire, beloved for her kindness and her role as a schoolteacher. Her murder left the community reeling, and the mailbox that had once been ignored now became the epicenter of a spreading nightmare. Panic set in quickly. Neighbors locked doors and barred windows, and many refused to leave their homes after dark. The mailbox had transformed into a sinister symbol, a harbinger of death. Yet, no one dared to destroy it, as if breaking the mailbox would somehow make the horror worse, like breaking the fragile boundary between the living and the unknown forces that now seemed to control the neighborhood's fate. The local police found themselves powerless. Each letter that arrived was precise in its predictions, but no clear suspects emerged. Surveillance cameras had been installed, but the mailbox remained undisturbed until the letters appeared. The handwriting remained consistent, the postmarks non-existent, and the timing suspiciously perfect. Police theorized it was an elaborate hoax or a twisted game by someone with intimate knowledge of the victims. However, no arrests followed, and no explanation sufficed to calm the terror. Ethan, the retired journalist, found himself drawn into the growing mystery, sensing that this was no ordinary criminal case. He began piecing together the timeline of events, cross-referencing letters with the locations and victims. The methodical nature of the killings revealed a pattern, a choreography of cruelty that pointed beyond a simple human mind. The precision was too clinical, the messages too eerily prescient. The community's fear morphed into paranoia. Old friends stopped speaking, neighbors avoided eye contact, and whispers filled the empty spaces where trust once lived. People started to suspect one another. Who had access to private details? Who might be capable of such cold calculation? Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed the killer was someone still living among them, watching silently, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Others whispered about curses or malevolent spirits tied to the mailbox itself, claiming the letters came from beyond the grave. The local media picked up the story, and soon reporters from outside the town arrived, drawn to the morbid fascination of a killer who sent warnings in advance. But their presence only intensified the community's anxiety. Tourists and thrill-seekers flocked to Willow Lane, taking photos of the mailbox and speculating on social media about the dark mystery. Yet, none could solve it. The letters remained the only clues, cryptic messages from a mind that seemed to exist outside normal understanding. One letter was especially chilling. It arrived the day after Claire's murder, written in the same spidery handwriting but with a new urgency. It warned of another killing, even more brutal, and gave the exact time and place. This time, it wasn't a stranger who would be the victim, but someone the community knew well, a man who had helped organize neighborhood watch groups and tried to keep the peace. His name was Michael. Michael was found dead exactly as the letter described, hours after it was received. The murder scene was horrifying, filled with signs of struggle and despair. The mailbox had predicted 2 murders in less than a week, and the terror that gripped Willow Lane tightened its grip. Ethan's investigation led him to search historical records about the mailbox and the killer from the 1960s who had once used it to torment the town. The parallels were too striking to ignore. The original murderer, known only as the Willow Killer, had sent letters to the police and victims' families, taunting authorities and promising new crimes. His capture had brought relief, but left scars that lingered in the town's collective memory. The thought that the mailbox could still be active decades later was unthinkable, yet the evidence was undeniable. Letters continued arriving, each more sinister than the last. The community's sense of reality was fracturing, caught between past horrors and present terror. The boundaries between what was real and what was supernatural seemed to blur. Ethan theorized that the mailbox was a conduit, an object through which something ancient, dark, and malevolent communicated. The original killer was long dead, but something else had taken up the mantle. Whether a ghost, a copycat, or something beyond human comprehension was unclear. The letters suggested intelligence, cruelty, and an intimate knowledge of fear. As more victims were claimed, the town's response became desperate. Some residents tried to destroy the mailbox, but their attempts failed. Rust and grime made it immovable, and it always reappeared by the roadside, as if summoned back by unseen forces. Others sought help from psychics and paranormal experts, hoping to understand the entity behind the letters. The mailbox seemed to embody a warning that no one could ignore. The past was not finished with Willow Lane. The murders were part of a cycle, a repeating nightmare fed by fear and bloodshed. The letters were more than predictions. They were demands, messages from a darkness that sought to control the fate of everyone who lived there. Despite the chaos, Ethan refused to give in to despair. His curiosity drove him onward, compelling him to uncover every detail, no matter how disturbing. He spoke to families of victims, friends who had vanished into silence, and even former police officers who had once investigated the original Willow killer. Each conversation added pieces to a puzzle too complex for simple answers. The letters themselves became a morbid obsession for many. Some saved them like grim trophies, while others burned them in vain attempts to break the curse. The mailbox, however, remained, its flag stuck upright, as if signaling another message yet to come. The neighborhood no longer resembled the safe, peaceful place it once was. It had become a shadow of itself, haunted not just by memories, but by a force that defied logic and reason. The mailbox at the end of Willow Lane had transformed from a forgotten relic into a deadly oracle, dictating the lives and deaths of all who lived nearby. The question that haunted Ethan most was this: who or what was writing these letters? And what was the final goal of this relentless, chilling correspondence? No one in Willow Lane wanted to find out. As the letters continued arriving, the intensity of fear in the neighborhood deepened, but so did the complexity of the messages. The handwriting remained the same, jagged, erratic, yet deliberate, signaling a mind both unstable and methodical. But the content of the letters began to change. No longer were they simply predictions of murder. Instead, they took on an increasingly personal tone, addressing specific residents by name, revealing secrets no one had shared outside their closest circle. Some letters contained details about events long buried, affairs, hidden addictions, bitter disputes, and unsolved crimes from decades ago. It was as if the sender had been watching, listening, waiting patiently for the right moment to expose everyone's darkest truths. The mailbox was no longer just a tool for terrorizing the community with death. It was weaponizing shame and guilt. Residents who once felt safe in their anonymity found their pasts dragged into the open. Rumors about who could be responsible for this new onslaught ran rampant, but no one dared confront the mailbox directly. Its power seemed supernatural. Every attempt to remove or destroy it failed inexplicably. Reports came in of the mailbox being found in different places along the road or reappearing overnight, untouched despite efforts to dismantle it. It was as if it belonged to another realm, untouchable and eternal. Ethan's obsession turned inward. He had started as an investigator, searching for facts and patterns, but now he felt hunted, as if the letters had singled him out for something more. He received an envelope containing a letter unlike any before. No threats of violence, no cryptic riddles, but a direct message warning him to stop digging or face consequences worse than death. His name was spelled out carefully, followed by a chilling line, "Some truths are meant to stay buried." The threat was clear, but so was the challenge. Instead of retreating, Ethan felt a grim determination to uncover the source, even if it meant facing dangers he couldn't yet imagine. The letter's impact extended beyond the victims and immediate residents. The police, initially dismissive, now struggled with rising pressure from local officials and media outlets demanding answers. Task forces were assembled, surveillance was intensified, and psychological profilers were consulted. Yet, no lead proved fruitful. The impossible accuracy of the letters defied logical explanations. Suspicion fell on several individuals with troubled pasts, outcasts, loners, and people connected to previous crimes. But every theory collapsed under the weight of new murders that seemed to come from nowhere, as if orchestrated by an unseen hand. The killings were no longer random acts of violence, but carefully executed performances designed to terrorize, confuse, and control. In parallel, reports emerged from some neighbors about strange phenomena near the mailbox. Flickering lights, unexplained sounds, and cold spots chilled the air. A pervasive feeling of being watched settled over Willow Lane, as if an invisible presence lingered, feeding on fear and despair. Some residents refused to leave, despite the growing dangers. They spoke of being tied to the place by memories, by history, or by some unknown force. Others fled, leaving homes abandoned and streets empty at night. The once vibrant neighborhood was now a ghost town of suspicion, silence, and shadows. Amid this chaos, Ethan uncovered a connection that others had missed. The letters referenced not only past crimes, but also historical events tied to the town's darker chapters, unsolved disappearances, forgotten tragedies, and scandals swept under the rug. These were wounds the community had never healed, and the mailbox was reopening them one by one. The realization struck him like a blow. The mailbox was not just about present terror. It was a reckoning, a manifestation of a collective guilt and unresolved pain. The murders were the physical expression of a deeper rot festering beneath the surface of a seemingly peaceful town. The letters hinted at a force that transcended human understanding, a presence that demanded attention, confession, and perhaps even sacrifice. It was as if the mailbox itself was alive, a vessel for justice or vengeance that no one could control. Ethan delved into folklore and urban legends, seeking parallels in history and myth. Stories of cursed objects, haunted places, and vengeful spirits flooded his research. Some suggested that the mailbox was possessed, a gateway for a restless entity condemned to torment the living until its own grievances were settled. Others theorized about secret societies or cults manipulating the neighborhood from the shadows, using the mailbox as a tool for psychological warfare. But none of these theories fully explained the chilling precision or the growing supernatural elements reported by witnesses. Meanwhile, the victims became more than statistics. Each name carried a story of fear, regret, and loss. Families shattered, friendships destroyed, and the social fabric unraveled. The mailbox's reach extended into every corner of life, turning even ordinary days into potential moments of horror. Ethan's determination grew alongside the danger. He believed that understanding the mailbox's origin and the identity of the new killer, or entity, was the only way to stop the nightmare. But each answer uncovered only more questions. The deeper he dug, the more the past and present blurred, revealing a darkness that refused to be confined to any single person or time. This darkness was patient. It was cunning. It waited in silence, striking unpredictably and vanishing without trace. The mailbox was its voice, a relentless reminder that in Willow Lane, nothing was ever truly buried. The tension in the neighborhood reached a breaking point as the letters began to evolve in their purpose and tone. They no longer merely predicted deaths or exposed secrets. Now they actively manipulated the residents' lives. People found themselves coerced into impossible decisions, caught in psychological traps designed to fracture their sanity. The mailbox was no longer just a symbol of fear, it had become a weapon of control. Neighbors who had previously tried to band together found themselves turning on one another, their relationships strained beyond repair. The letters played on their deepest insecurities and rivalries, revealing betrayals that some had long hoped would stay hidden. Trust was a casualty, replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Friends stopped speaking, families fractured. The community was unraveling like a thread pulled too tight. Authorities struggled to contain the chaos. Law enforcement increased patrols, and the mailbox became a focal point for forensic investigation, but every attempt to interfere only seemed to make matters worse. Letters would appear at times when no one was watching, messages that seemed to anticipate every move made to prevent the next tragedy. The killer's, or entity's, ability to predict and react made them untouchable. Psychological profiling reached no consensus. Experts debated whether they were dealing with a deranged human or something beyond the ordinary. The mailbox defied the laws of time and space, its messages sometimes arriving before the predicted events occurred. Investigators began to entertain the impossible, that the mailbox might be connected to something supernatural or that the killer had inside knowledge impossible for any mortal to possess. Among the residents, a few brave souls attempted to uncover the truth or at least protect their neighbors. Some organized neighborhood watches, while others sought out spiritual or occult help. Attempts to cleanse the mailbox with rituals or prayers brought no relief. Instead, reports of strange occurrences increased, shadows flickering at the edge of vision, whispered voices carried on the wind, and cold spots where the air seemed to thicken with dread. Ethan, the retired journalist, found himself both drawn deeper into the mystery and increasingly isolated. His warnings and theories were met with skepticism or outright hostility by many who refused to believe in anything beyond the tangible. Yet, he could not ignore the growing evidence that the mailbox's curse was real and active. His research led him to an obscure account from the 19th century, describing a similar series of events in another town. There, a mailbox had also become the epicenter of terror, with letters predicting crimes and stirring panic. The parallels were striking, but the old records hinted at an even darker truth, a curse passed down through generations, tied to a specific object that brought ruin wherever it appeared. Ethan wondered if the mailbox on Willow Lane was the same object, or at least a replica infused with the same malevolence. The idea was terrifying, an ancient curse capable of transcending time and geography, adapting to new victims and continuing its deadly game. The letters grew more elaborate, including cryptic symbols and references to historical events and local legends. They challenged residents to solve puzzles or confront personal demons, suggesting that the mailbox's power was tied not only to murder but to some unknown ritual or bargain. The victims were not chosen randomly but as part of a larger design, a pattern Ethan struggled to decipher. Amid the mounting terror, the police uncovered a connection between the recent victims and a series of unsolved crimes dating back decades. These cold cases involved missing persons, strange disappearances, and brutal assaults, many of which had been dismissed or forgotten. The mailbox seemed to be forcing the community to reckon with a violent past it had tried to ignore. This realization brought a new kind of fear, one not just of death, but of revelation. The mailbox was a living history of the neighborhood's darkest secrets, exposing sins and silences long buried. It was a mirror reflecting the town's hidden decay, a reminder that no secret could remain safe forever. As the body count rose, some residents chose to leave, desperate to escape the mailbox's influence. Their departures left empty homes and broken families, turning Willow Lane into a shadow of its former self. Those who stayed lived in constant dread, haunted by the knowledge that the mailbox could strike again at any moment and that the next letter might be addressed to them. Ethan continued his pursuit of the truth, driven by a mixture of fear, guilt, and stubborn resolve. He understood that stopping the mailbox required more than police work or logic. It demanded confronting something ancient and unfathomable, something that defied human understanding. He sought out experts in the occult, historians, and anyone who might hold a piece of the puzzle. Each new lead brought him closer to a terrible conclusion. The mailbox was not just an object, but a vessel for an entity that thrived on fear, chaos, and retribution. It was an agent of vengeance, demanding justice on a scale beyond human law. The community's struggle was no longer against a single killer, but against a force that could manipulate time, space, and minds. The mailbox's power extended beyond death, twisting reality itself to enforce its cruel will. Despite the overwhelming odds, Ethan believed there was a way to end the nightmare. The letters hinted at a ritual, a final confrontation hidden in the obscure references scattered throughout their text. But the path to that confrontation was perilous, filled with traps and tests designed to break the will and consume the soul. Every step closer to the truth put Ethan in greater danger. Threats against him intensified, both in letters and through shadowy figures who seemed determined to silence his investigation. The line between friend and foe blurred as paranoia infected the community. Yet, even as fear threatened to destroy everything, a small flicker of hope remained. The mailbox, for all its darkness, was bound by rules that Ethan was determined to decipher. The key to stopping the terror lay in understanding those rules and breaking the cycle of violence. The stakes were higher than ever. Willow Lane's fate, and perhaps something far greater, depended on what Ethan would do next. The investigation grew more urgent as the mailbox's influence escalated beyond anyone's control. Each new letter seemed to sharpen its cruelty, mixing threats with twisted riddles and impossible demands. It was clear that the mailbox wasn't just a passive tool, it was an active force shaping the lives of those it touched, feeding off their fear and desperation. In the days following the latest murder, anxiety reached a fever pitch. No one felt safe, and every glance toward the mailbox was filled with dread. Its blackened metal surface had become a symbol of death and hopelessness. Attempts to ignore it only seemed to strengthen its grip. People talked about curses and old vendettas, while others whispered about a malevolent intelligence lurking behind the mail slot. The letters increasingly demanded sacrifices, choices between protecting loved ones or revealing devastating secrets. These impossible moral dilemmas tore families apart, pushing ordinary people to the brink of madness. The mailbox was no longer just about revealing truths or predicting violence. It had become a puppeteer, forcing residents to enact a sinister play from which there was no escape. As the psychological pressure mounted, Ethan found himself haunted by the consequences of his obsession. His once orderly life unraveled. Sleep became scarce, replaced by nightmares filled with cryptic messages and shadowy figures. Friends and allies distanced themselves, afraid to be caught in the escalating horror. Even the local police, who had initially dismissed his theories, began to suspect there was something far beyond human cruelty at work. Ethan's research revealed a disturbing pattern. The mailbox's curse followed a cycle, appearing in different towns every few decades, always leaving a trail of destruction. The old cases he uncovered were eerily similar: strange deaths, mysterious disappearances, and a relentless series of letters sent to the doomed victims. The curse seemed to choose its time and place with precision, feeding on the darkness already present in each community. The mailbox itself was the epicenter of the curse, a cursed artifact imbued with unknown powers. Some believed it to be possessed by a vengeful spirit. Others suspected it was a vessel for an ancient entity demanding retribution. Regardless of the source, the mailbox's influence warped reality around it, twisting the minds and lives of those nearby. In the midst of this escalating nightmare, Ethan uncovered the existence of a secret society rumored to have once controlled or contained the mailbox's power. Records indicated that this group had tried to bury the artifact and the curse multiple times, using rituals and sacrifices to keep it dormant. But each attempt failed, and the curse resurfaced again, more vicious and unrelenting than before. Determined to break the cycle, Ethan sought out the few remaining descendants of the society. Their knowledge was fragmented, shrouded in secrecy and fear. Some had fled the area, unwilling to confront the curse again. Others had been silenced or disappeared. Those who remained were wary but recognized the urgency of the situation. Through painstaking research and careful interviews, Ethan pieced together the components of a counter-ritual, one that might sever the mailbox's hold on the town. But the ritual came with a heavy price. It required someone to confront the curse directly, to enter a realm where fear and death merged, and to make a sacrifice that could cost everything. The community, already broken by terror and mistrust, struggled to unite around this hope. Many feared the ritual was a trap, that it might worsen the curse or unleash something even more terrible. Others, overwhelmed by despair, preferred to leave rather than face the unknown. Meanwhile, the mailbox's messages grew more personal and insidious. It began to reveal details about Ethan's own life, his past mistakes, regrets, and secrets, turning his investigation into a battle for his own soul. The curse seemed to know him intimately, testing his resolve and breaking down his defenses. Despite the mounting odds, Ethan pressed forward. His resolve hardened into something fierce, born of a mixture of guilt and the desperate need to protect the community. The ritual became his obsession, a path he believed would end the nightmare once and for all. But as the day of the ritual approached, strange and terrifying phenomena increased. The veil between the world and whatever force animated the mailbox grew thin. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, whispers echoed through empty streets, and the air thickened with dread. The town was caught in a liminal space, balanced precariously between reality and something darker. The mailbox stood at the center of this, a beacon for fear and pain, ready to consume whatever or whoever dared to challenge it. Ethan prepared to face the curse, knowing that success meant liberation but failure meant oblivion, not just for him, but for the entire community. The mailbox's power was ancient, relentless, and beyond human comprehension. It had survived centuries by feeding on fear, deception, and death. In the final hours before the ritual, Ethan gathered what little strength remained. He understood that breaking the curse required more than courage. It demanded sacrifice, an acceptance of darkness, and the willingness to pay the ultimate price. As the mailbox loomed in the distance, Silent and immovable, Ethan stepped forward, determined to end the nightmare that had claimed so many lives and shattered so many souls. The ritual began as a fragile thread of hope, the last desperate attempt to sever the mailbox's curse from the town's fate. Every detail mattered: the timing, the words spoken, the objects arranged in a precise pattern. Each step was fraught with danger, a misstep capable of unleashing unimaginable horror instead of salvation. The atmosphere thickened with tension, as if the very air itself resisted the effort to undo what had been woven through decades, centuries even. The mailbox, cold and unmoving, sat at the heart of it all, a silent sentinel of suffering. Its dark presence seemed to pulse with a life of its own, reacting to the ritual with subtle shifts in shadow and sound. The boundary between this world and the realm that fed the curse grew thin, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The sacrifice demanded by the ritual was not simply physical. It was a surrender of self, an offering of one's soul to appease the ancient force. The cost was clear, yet it was the only way to break the cycle of death and fear. The curse did not simply consume lives. It consumed hope and will, leaving behind only despair. As the ritual progressed, the ground beneath seemed to tremble with the weight of generations of pain. Echoes of past tragedies reverberated through the town, a chorus of sorrow and rage that had been bottled within the mailbox's curse. The entity feeding on this anguish responded with increasing ferocity, lashing out through the very fabric of the town's reality. Time itself warped. Moments stretched and folded back upon themselves, making it difficult to distinguish past from present. The people trapped in this web of terror found their memories invaded, their identities blurred by the accumulated darkness. The mailbox was not just an object, but a gateway to a realm where suffering was eternal and malice infinite. Despite this, the ritual's executor held firm, their mind anchored by purpose and resolve, resisting the entity's attempts to corrupt and consume. It was a battle not just of strength, but of spirit, a confrontation between light and darkness within the soul. The entity, sensing its imminent defeat, unleashed visions and temptations designed to break the will. It showed glimpses of the future, horrors that awaited if the ritual failed, and promises of release if the sacrifice was abandoned. It whispered the deepest fears and regrets, hoping to sow doubt and despair. But the sacrifice did not falter. Each temptation was met with unwavering defiance. The ritual became a crucible of courage, forged by the knowledge that failure would condemn not only the town but countless others in an unending cycle of torment. At the ritual's climax, the entity's resistance shattered like glass. A final surge of power erupted from the mailbox, a roar that echoed across dimensions. The curse's hold weakened, unraveling thread by thread, releasing the trapped anguish and fury into the void. The mailbox itself cracked, its surface splitting to reveal emptiness where once darkness dwelled. The ancient force that had haunted Willow Lane was broken, banished from the world it had tormented for so long. Silence followed, the kind that fills a space after a storm has passed, heavy yet cleansing. The town, once suffocated by fear and suspicion, began to breathe again. The wounds left by the curse remained, but the grip of terror had been lifted. People cautiously emerged from their hiding places, tentative steps toward rebuilding shattered lives. Broken bonds mended slowly, trust seeded anew amidst the rubble of what had been lost. The mailbox was removed, taken away to a place where it could no longer harm. Ethan, though changed forever by the ordeal, found a bittersweet peace. The cost had been immense, not only in lives but in the price paid to confront darkness so profound. Yet, the knowledge that the cycle was broken brought a measure of solace. The story of the mailbox became a warning, a whispered tale passed down to remind others that some evils, no matter how ancient, can be challenged and overcome. The courage of those who stood against the curse lived on, a beacon against the encroaching night. But even in victory, the shadows lingered. The mailbox had been one chapter in a long saga of darkness that stretched beyond Willow Lane. The world held many such objects and curses, waiting patiently for the moment to rise again. For now, the nightmare had ended. The town was free, fragile, hopeful, and scarred. The battle was won, but the war against darkness was never truly over. End of Story 2. Story 3. It was supposed to be just another abandoned prison tour, until I pressed play on a tape that should have stayed buried forever. Behind the crumbling walls of a forgotten Georgia prison, a mysterious audio confession reveals a web of murder, corruption, and betrayal stretching from death row to the highest levels of justice. But the real horror begins when the events on the tape start happening again, one by one. This isn't just a confession. It's a curse. And by listening to it, the next name on the tape might be yours. The prison had been shut down for nearly 30 years, sealed off after a series of violent incidents no one wanted to talk about. Records were missing, families were silenced with payouts, and rumors became the only surviving history. Most people avoided the crumbling facility out of superstition, but for those chasing forgotten truths, it was a goldmine. Among the wreckage, a steel cabinet rusted shut in the corner of the former administration wing held a collection of unmarked tapes. Only one had a label, Confession 27. The tape had no official markings, no inmate name, no recording date. It wasn't catalogued anywhere in state archives, and when scanned, no audio ID could be traced. But when played, the grainy, distorted voice on the tape described events in detail. Murders, beatings, evidence tampering, even ritualistic abuse that had allegedly taken place within the prison walls. It wasn't a confession in the traditional sense. It wasn't a criminal admitting to their sins. It was something else entirely. It sounded more like a warning. And the voice didn't crack or stutter. It recited everything with eerie calm, as if the speaker knew the truth would never be believed. What made the tape disturbing wasn't just the content. It was the fact that the murders described in the recording hadn't occurred when the inmate was alive. At least 2 deaths mentioned happened weeks after the speaker's official execution. There was no logical explanation. Yet the names were real. The dates matched up. And the specific injuries described were never made public. How could someone know so much about things that hadn't yet happened? Initially dismissed as a prank or an elaborate hoax, further investigation only deepened the mystery. Audio engineers confirmed the age of the tape was consistent with the late 1980s. Background noise embedded in the recording contained echoes of distant prison alarms, authentic to the facility's old alert system. Forensics detected the speaker's breathing, stress patterns, and vocal fatigue, all indicating it was recorded in one take, without edits or manipulation. This was no forgery. Over the following days, strange coincidences began stacking up. The man who digitized the tape was found dead in his apartment. No sign of forced entry. No drugs in his system. Just a blank stare and a stopped heart. The security footage from the building went missing. A journalist who tried to run a story on the confession lost his job after a scandal involving falsified articles, except none of the pieces in question could be found online anymore. His bylines were gone. It was as if someone was erasing anyone who touched the recording. It became clear that the tape wasn't just evidence. It was a trigger, a curse. Every person who listened to the full confession found their lives unraveling in different but similarly tragic ways. One man went missing entirely. Another began speaking in his sleep, muttering phrases from the tape in the inmate's voice. Another was hospitalized with self-inflicted injuries, claiming he was trying to carve the name out of his skin, a phrase also spoken during the recording. Attempts to destroy the tape failed. Burn it, and it returned inside the player. Smash it, and the fragments would disappear, only for the original cassette to reappear in the drawer where it was first found. Even digital copies mysteriously reassembled themselves. It was as if the tape didn't want to be destroyed. It wanted to be heard. Over and over again. Rumors began to surface of a legend inside the prison during its operational years, about a prisoner who never existed in official records, yet was feared by both inmates and guards. A man referred to only as 27, who was said to know things before they happened. A death row inmate with no known trial date, no fingerprint records, and no listed cell assignment. Guards supposedly rotated out of that wing every few weeks, citing nightmares and hallucinations. But whenever internal investigators checked, they found nothing, just empty space, a sealed cell, and silence. The confession tape claimed that 27 had made a deal to come back after death, not to seek revenge, but to ensure that the truth of what happened in that prison would never be buried again. But the price of truth, it seemed, was steep. Anyone who listened was marked. Not all would die, but none would walk away unchanged. The words on the tape were more than just information. They were a chain, binding the listener to a loop of suffering that began long before the tape was made and would continue long after it was heard. The final seconds of the tape featured no voice, only silence. But when enhanced, experts found faint breathing, as if someone was standing very close to the microphone, still there, still waiting. And then came the whisper, not part of the confession, not even spoken by the original voice. A different tone entirely. It simply said, "Next," and then the tape would end. In the days following the tape's discovery, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Those who had even brief contact with the recording found themselves pulled into a vortex of inexplicable misfortunes. Initially, it seemed like coincidence, freak accidents, mental breakdowns, sudden disappearances. But the frequency and intensity escalated too quickly to ignore. The man who first reported the tape's existence was involved in a traffic collision that showed no brake marks, no signs of impact on the other vehicle. The other driver was never identified. The file was quietly closed. What began as fascination turned to dread. The more people tried to expose the tape, the more their lives unraveled. Investigators who reviewed it in full reported hearing new phrases not present in the original transcription. When those recordings were played back, the phrases were gone, yet each listener swore to the same words. "He watches the watchers. One will live, one will scream. You are already recorded." The unsettling uniformity of these auditory hallucinations suggested something far deeper than individual psychosis. It wasn't just the tape that was changing, it was the minds of those who heard it. Attempts to transcribe the tape were thwarted by strange typographical anomalies. No matter the software, no matter the person typing, the final paragraphs of the confession would not stay fixed. Words repeated where they shouldn't. Sentences twisted themselves, rearranged into warnings or riddles. One transcriber insisted that the words on her screen began typing themselves, even after she stepped away from the keyboard. When her draft was recovered later, it ended mid-sentence with the phrase, "He is listening as you read this." A researcher who conducted an audio frequency analysis reported finding a low-frequency signal embedded beneath the confession, not audible to the human ear but present in every version of the tape, analog or digital. The frequency resembled known infrasound patterns associated with anxiety, dread, and hallucinations. But there was something more. Within the waveform, he identified a recurring pulse every 27 seconds. Not mechanical, not natural. It resembled a distorted heartbeat. When he cross-referenced this with brain scan studies of test subjects exposed to the audio, all scans showed elevated activity in the auditory cortex, even hours after the tape was turned off. By then, the deaths had reached a number that couldn't be rationalized. A sound engineer collapsed on a train platform without warning. A university professor suffered a psychotic break and clawed his own eyes out, muttering about burning faces behind the wall. A former inmate, interviewed for insight into the prison's past, was found in his motel room surrounded by newspaper clippings and written statements he never submitted. Pinned to the wall above his body in jagged handwriting was the phrase, "You weren't supposed to remember." Authorities attempted to contain the panic. Files were sealed. Access was revoked. The existence of Confession 27 became classified under obscure legal statutes. But the damage had already spread. Bootleg copies circulated in underground forums. Most were incomplete, broken, corrupted, too damaged to play. But those that remained intact never stayed in one place. Accounts were deleted, users banned or vanished. Links that once worked redirected to blank pages or endless error loops. It was as though the tape didn't just erase people, it erased proof of their existence. Whistleblowers emerged with increasingly disturbing claims. One claimed that the confession was part of an experimental psychological weapon developed during the Cold War. an attempt to induce fear, guilt, and spiritual collapse using voice frequency alone. Another suggested the voice on the tape didn't belong to a human being at all, but something that mimicked human patterns just enough to pass undetected. A former intelligence analyst stated under anonymity that Confession 27 was only one of 33 known tapes, all buried in black site storage. The others, he claimed, had been lost, stolen, or worse, played. No one could explain why the tape couldn't be destroyed. Fire didn't scorch it. Water didn't warp it. When frozen, it hummed faintly. When buried, it surfaced within days. It returned to the location it was last played, like a haunting object tied to memory itself. One group of researchers tested this by sealing it inside a lead container and transporting it across the country. 3 days later, the lead box was empty. The tape was found in the original prison archive drawer, exactly where it was first discovered. There was no containing it. Every time someone tried to bury the truth, the tape unearthed it again, this time louder, sharper, more desperate. And those who thought themselves immune, those who never pressed play but came close to the sound, began reporting dreams. Vivid, specific dreams of cold cement walls, red lights flashing, and a voice speaking numbers in reverse. Those who recounted the dreams all claimed to wake up with ringing ears and the echo of the same sentence, "You're next on the list." By now, a handful of people realized the danger wasn't in the tape itself. It was in the act of listening. Because once the confession entered your memory, it lived there. It nested in the corners of thought. And the more you thought about it, the clearer it became, until eventually you weren't just remembering someone else's words, you were speaking them yourself. The theory that the confession wasn't merely recorded audio but a form of cognitive infection began gaining ground among the few researchers still willing to examine it. Unlike a normal recording, the tape did not follow consistent playback behavior. Listeners described different emotional tones, varying background noises, and inconsistencies in word choice, even when played from the same physical copy. This deviation suggested that the tape was interacting with each listener on a psychological level, adjusting itself to exploit individual vulnerabilities. No two interpretations were exactly the same, yet all shared the same dreadful conclusion: the voice knew who was listening. Those who tried isolating the tape's audio signature using advanced digital tools discovered another anomaly. Hidden beneath the spoken words were layered frequencies that bore a disturbing resemblance to human brainwave patterns, particularly those linked to deep sleep, REM cycles, and lucid dreaming. These embedded waves mirrored theta rhythms, which often appear when the brain is most suggestible. The tape wasn't just delivering a message, it was shaping perception, planting false memories, and creating a shared hallucination across multiple listeners. In some reports, subjects began recalling events they had never experienced, conversations they had never had, and crimes they had never committed, yet spoke of with disturbing clarity. Victims of prolonged exposure exhibited symptoms of extreme paranoia and dissociation. Some developed full-blown Capgras delusion, claiming loved ones had been replaced by imposters. Others expressed belief that they were no longer real themselves, that they were now recordings inside someone else's memory. One patient, when shown a mirror, refused to recognize their reflection. They insisted the tape had unrecorded them. Another patient, previously stable, described feeling their thoughts being overwritten. He claimed to wake up with sentences in his mind that weren't his own, always beginning with the same phrase, "Let me finish." Investigations into the origins of the tape grew more frantic and obscure. Tracing its creation led to multiple dead ends. Some believed the tape was part of an abandoned government experiment involving psychological warfare, while others were convinced it was an artifact from a failed consciousness transfer experiment, a project that attempted to map and preserve a dying man's mind onto magnetic tape. The more people searched, the more impossible the tape's origin became. Records contradicted themselves. Names appeared in case files with no birth certificates or death records. Some researchers who dug too deeply claimed their memories began to shift. Colleagues denied ever meeting them. Email threads vanished. Photos from events they clearly remembered appeared with someone else in their place. Whispers of something older, more primal, began circulating. An archivist suggested the voice matched phonetic patterns from ancient Mesopotamian incantations. Another linguist noted the cadence of the confession resembled ritualistic chant structures used in funerary rites, specifically ones designed to trap or transfer souls. Audio engineers confirmed that when slowed down drastically, the voice took on unnatural qualities, echoes not caused by environment but embedded within the signal itself, as if multiple voices were speaking in layers, each delayed by a few milliseconds. Some heard children laughing. Others heard screams. A few described hearing themselves, saying things they had never said aloud. By now, anyone involved in handling the tape long-term either vanished or withdrew in isolation. Government records became sealed under obscure security classifications. Freedom of Information Act requests were denied without explanation. Private facilities that once stored the tape either burned down or suffered catastrophic system failures. Surveillance footage was corrupted. Backup systems inexplicably wiped. When archivists tried converting the confession to a different file format, the systems failed to process the final minute of audio, an exact moment where multiple deaths had reportedly occurred. One technician claimed he saw a face flicker in the waveform visualization. Others refused to verify it. Survivors of exposure often described a moment of realization that triggered their collapse. Not fear, not guilt, but the overwhelming sense that the tape was not finished. That every time someone listened, the confession changed slightly, not because it was incomplete, but because it was still being written. As if the voice needed ears to continue. As if every listener became another sentence. Another chapter. The last known incident tied to the tape occurred when a rogue audio blogger attempted a deep dive analysis on a podcast episode. He claimed to have isolated a hidden message in reverse that said, "You are the next voice." He posted this finding to a private server. The server crashed within an hour. The blog's domain expired the next day, even though it had been prepaid for 5 years. His personal accounts were deleted. His apartment was found abandoned, computer systems dismantled, hard drives missing. On his whiteboard, a single phrase was scrawled in black marker, "I didn't confess. It used my voice." At this point, those still aware of the tape's existence began referring to it not as an object, but as a process. A contagion of memory, voice, and sound. Not bound by file formats or tape reels. Not stopped by distance or deletion. The true horror wasn't that the confession was real. The horror was that reality itself began bending to match the confession. Whatever truth it once recorded had long since become irrelevant. The recording had become its own truth, and now it only needed new listeners to continue growing. In the aftermath of its final known circulation, the confession tape had become more than a mysterious recording. It had evolved into something that behaved like a conceptual parasite. Unlike a traditional virus, it didn't require a physical medium to spread. Mentions of the tape in old forum threads, obscure academic papers, or even whispered urban legends were enough to trigger latent symptoms in those who had never physically heard it. The phenomenon baffled cognitive scientists, who began referring to it as a mimetic echo, a piece of information so powerful it could replicate itself through abstract association, bypassing auditory input altogether. Those affected by second-hand exposure didn't display immediate signs. The unraveling began subtly: persistent déjà vu, loss of temporal awareness, the inability to remember certain words or names. Then came the shared dreams, eerily vivid experiences where individuals reported hearing a voice speaking directly to them. What made these dreams truly disturbing wasn't their content, but their consistency. Patients from opposite sides of the country described nearly identical dream sequences. The voice always began the same way: "You already know what happened. Now say it out loud." With growing concern, mental institutions began documenting these dream phenomena as a possible mass psychogenic illness. But something didn't add up. Individuals diagnosed with unrelated disorders, schizophrenia, dissociative identity disorder, PTSD, suddenly began referencing the same confession, using phrases never made public. They used identical metaphors: the ticking room, the mirror that breathes, the shadow that speaks in Rewind. Some even reproduced transcripts of segments that had supposedly been lost or corrupted beyond recovery. Attempts to isolate the tape's influence through controlled environments backfired. A team of experimental psychologists in Austria created a soundproof lab and attempted to transcribe the tape without actually listening to it, relying solely on machine learning prediction. Within weeks, half of the team resigned. One researcher was found dead with a note stating, "I am not the voice, but it's inside me now." The AI used in the transcription attempt began generating its own confessions in different languages, none of which it was programmed to understand. One of the generated files ended in a single chilling line, translated from ancient Greek, "This is not what was said, this is what needed to be said." Cultural analysts and philosophers weighed in, proposing that the tape wasn't just a cursed object or psychological anomaly, it was a narrative anomaly. Stories, at their core, impose order on chaos. They define reality by assigning cause and effect, motive and consequence. The confession tape subverted this function. It didn't clarify, it corrupted. It told a story so convincing, so immersive, that reality around it bent to support the tale. People didn't just believe in the tape's events, they remembered living them. Some even confessed to crimes that were never committed, with forensic evidence appearing to validate their claims. It was as if the story itself was retroactively rewriting existence to support its own narrative integrity. The legal system, already skeptical, tried to ignore these anomalies until one particularly unsettling case emerged. A man in Missouri turned himself in, claiming to have committed the exact same murder described in the original tape. He described the victim in graphic detail: clothing, location, weapon. Authorities were baffled to discover the details matched a cold case from 1986 that had no public documentation. The real twist came when DNA tests confirmed the man's blood was at the crime scene, despite him being only 5 years old at the time of the murder. Court transcripts sealed the confession, but those who read it reported a strange side effect. They began losing personal memories, replaced by scenes from the murder. Desperation grew among archivists and cryptographers seeking to contain the spread. An underground coalition was formed, calling themselves the Silent Frame. Their objective was to erase all digital and physical traces of the confession. They infiltrated internet archives, burned microfilm backups, and corrupted metadata chains. Still, for every instance deleted, another would surface in an unexpected format: a child's notebook filled with eerily accurate confessions, a song uploaded by an anonymous artist with reversed vocals matching segments of the tape, even a street mural in Detroit that depicted the confession word for word, painted by an unknown hand. At this stage, the only consensus left was that the tape could no longer be considered linear media. It behaved more like a distributed entity, a neural parasite that used language as a host. Some claimed it had become semi-sentient, evolving with each new listener, learning from reactions, and reconfiguring its structure to remain just believable enough to see doubt, fear, and guilt. And once it found the perfect psychological resonance, it would anchor itself in a person's mind, gradually dissolving their sense of self until only the confession remained. The final breakthrough came not from a scientist or researcher, but from a dying man in hospice care who claimed he had created the original recording decades earlier, not as a confession, but as a ritual. He insisted the voice wasn't his, but something he had let in. According to his written testimony, the tape was never meant to be played, it was meant to be sealed. It was a vessel, a prison, a voice that once belonged to no one, now seeking someone. In his last entry, he wrote, "The voice is only silent when it is heard. The story ends when no one remembers. But we always remember. And that's what made it so dangerous." And that brings us to the end of tonight's disturbing journey. If you're still with us, you're one of the brave ones. These stories aren't just meant to scare. They're meant to remind us that some truths lie buried beneath silence, and sometimes, silence is where the real terror begins. If tonight's tale left your mind unsettled and your thoughts racing, you're not alone. Every story told here has shadows that reach out beyond the screen, and now that you've listened, maybe they've reached you too. Don't forget to like the video if the darkness kept you hooked, and subscribe to Mr. Darsnights for more spine-chilling stories you won't hear anywhere else. New nightmares drop regularly, So hit the bell icon to never miss when the next one creeps in. And remember, the scariest stories aren't always fiction. Some of them are already waiting, just outside your door. Until next time, sleep, if you still can.